Chapters 7 and 8 of John Barleycorn, or Alcoholic Memoirs, by Jack London. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Chapter 7. I was barely turned 15 and working long hours in a cannery. Month in and month out, the shortest day I ever worked was 10 hours. When to 10 hours of actual work at a machine is added the noon hour, the walking to work and walking home from work, the getting up in the morning, dressing and eating, the eating at night, undressing and going to bed, there remains no more than the 9 hours out of the 24 required by a healthy youngster for sleep. Out of those 9 hours, after I was in bed and ere my eyes drowsed shut, I managed to steal a little time for reading. But many a night I did not knock off work until midnight. On occasion, I worked 18 and 20 hours on a stretch. Once I worked at my machine for 36 consecutive hours. And there were weeks on end when I never knocked off work earlier than 11 o'clock, got home and in bed at half after midnight, and was called at 5:30 to dress, eat, walk to work, and be at my machine at 7 o'clock whistle blow. No moments here to be stolen for my beloved books. And what had John Barleycorn to do with such strenuous, stoic toil of a lad just turned 15? He had everything to do with it. Let me show you. I asked myself if this were the meaning of life, to be a work beast. I knew of no horse in the city of Oakland that worked the hours I worked. If this were living, I was entirely unenamoured of it. I remembered my skiff lying idle and accumulating barnacles at the boat wharf. I remembered the wind that blew every day on the bay, the sunrises and sunsets I never saw, the bite of the salt air in my nostrils, the bite of the salt water on my flesh when I plunged overside. I remembered all the beauty and the wonder and the sense delights of the world denied me. There was only one way to escape my deadening toil. I must get out and away on the water. I must earn my bread on the water. And the way of the water led inevitably to John Barleycorn. I did not know this, and when I did learn it, I was courageous enough not to retreat back to my bestial life at the machine. I wanted to be where the winds of adventure blew. And the winds of adventure blew the oyster pirate sloops up and down San Francisco Bay, from raided oyster beds and fights at night on shoal and flat to markets in the morning against city wharves where peddlers and saloon keepers came down to buy. Every raid on an oyster bed was a felony. The penalty was state imprisonment, the stripes and the lockstep. And what of that? The men in stripes worked a shorter day than I at my machine. And there was vastly more romance in being an oyster pirate or a convict than in being a machine slave. And behind it all, behind all of me with youth abubble, whispered romance, adventure. So I interviewed my Mammy Jenny, my old nurse at whose black breast I had suckled. She was more prosperous than my folks. She was nursing sick people at a good weekly wage. Would she lend her white child the money? Would she? What she had was mine. Then I sought out French Frank, the oyster pirate, who wanted to sell, I had heard, his sloop, the Razzle Dazzle. I found him lying at anchor on the Alameda side of the estuary near the Webster Street Bridge, with visitors aboard whom he was entertaining with afternoon wine. He came on deck to talk business. He was willing to sell. But it was Sunday. Besides, he had guests. On the morrow he would make out the bill of sale, and I could enter into possession. And in the meantime I must come below and meet his friends. There were two sisters, Mamie and Tess, a Mrs. Hadley who chaperoned them, Whiskey Bob, a youthful oyster pirate of 16, and Spider Healy, a black-whiskered wharf rat of 20. Mamie, who was Spider's niece, was called the Queen of the Oyster Pirates, and on occasion presided at their revels. French Frank was in love with her, though I did not know it at the time, and she steadfastly refused to marry him. French Frank poured a tumbler of red wine from a big demijohn to drink to our transaction. I remembered the red wine of the Italian rancho, and shuddered inwardly. Whiskey and beer were not quite so repulsive. But the Queen of the Oyster Pirates was looking at me, a part-emptied glass in her own hand. I had my pride. If I was only 15, at least I could not show myself any less a man than she. Besides, there were her sister, and Mrs. Hadley, and the young oyster pirate, and the whiskered wharf rat, all with glasses in their hands. Was I a milk-and-water sop? No, 1,000 times no, and 1,000 glasses no. I downed the tumblerful like a man. French Frank was elated by the sale, which I had bound with a $20 gold piece. He poured more wine. I had learned my strong head and stomach, and I was certain I could drink with them in a temperate way and not poison myself for a week to come. I could stand as much as they, and besides, they had already been drinking for some time. We got to singing. Spider sang The Boston Burglar and Black Lulu. The Queen sang Then I Wished I Were a Little Bird. And her sister Tess sang Oh, Treat My Daughter Kindly. The fun grew fast and furious. I found myself able to miss drinks without being noticed or called to account. Also, standing in the companionway, head and shoulders out and glass in hand, I could fling the wine overboard. I reasoned something like this. It is a queerness of these people that they like this vile-tasting wine. Well, let them. I cannot quarrel with their tastes. My manhood, according to their queer notions, must compel me to appear to like this wine. Very well, I shall so appear, but I shall drink no more than is unavoidable. And the Queen began to make love to me, the latest recruit to the oyster pirate fleet, and no mere hand, but a master and owner. She went upon deck to take the air, and took me with her. She knew, of course, but I never dreamed, how French Frank was raging down below. Then Tess joined us, sitting on the cabin, and Spider and Bob, and at the last Mrs. Hadley and French Frank. And we sat there, glasses in hand, and sang, while the big demijohn went around, and I was the only strictly sober one. And I enjoyed it as no one of them was able to enjoy it. Here, in this atmosphere of bohemianism, I could not but contrast the scene with my scene of the day before, sitting at my machine in the stifling, shut-in air, endlessly repeating at top speed my series of mechanical motions. And here I sat now, glass in hand, in warm, glowing camaraderie with the oyster pirates, adventurers who refused to be slaves to petty routine, who flouted restrictions and the law, who carried their lives and their liberty in their hands. And it was through John Barleycorn that I came to join this glorious company of free souls, unashamed and unafraid. And the afternoon sea breeze blew its tang into my lungs and curled the waves in mid-channel. Before it came the scow schooners, wing and wing, blowing their horns for the drawbridges to open. Red-stacked tugs tow by, rocking the razzle-dazzle in the waves of their wake. A sugar bark towed from the boneyard to sea. The sun-wash was on the crisping water, and life was big. And Spider sang, "Oh, it's Lulu, black Lulu, my darlin'. Oh, it's where have you been so long? Been layin' in jail, a-waitin' for bail, till my bully comes rollin' along." There it was, the smack and slap of the spirit of revolt, of adventure, of romance, of the things forbidden and done defiantly and grandly. And I knew that on the morrow I would not go back to my machine at the cannery. Tomorrow I would be an oyster pirate, as free a freebooter as the century and the waters of San Francisco Bay would permit. Spider had already agreed to sail with me as my crew of one, and also as cook while I did the deck work. We would outfit our grub and water in the morning, hoist the big mainsail, which was a bigger piece of canvas than any I had ever sailed under, and beat our way out the estuary on the first of the sea breeze and the last of the ebb. Then we would slack sheets, and on the first of the flood run down the bay to the Asparagus Islands, where we would anchor miles offshore. And at last my dream would be realized. I would sleep upon the water. And next morning I would wake upon the water, and thereafter all my days and nights would be on the water. And the Queen asked me to row her ashore in my skiff, when at sunset French Frank prepared to take his guests ashore. Nor did I catch the significance of his abrupt change of plan when he turned the task of rowing his skiff over to Whiskey Bob, himself remaining on board the sloop. Nor did I understand Spider's grinning side remark to me, "Gee, there's nothing slow about you." How could it possibly enter my boy's head that a grizzled man of 50 should be jealous of me? Chapter 8. We met by appointment early Monday morning, to complete the deal, in Johnny Heinhold's Last Chance, a saloon, of course, for the transactions of men. I paid the money over, received the bill of sale, and French Frank treated. This struck me as an evident custom and a logical one. The seller who receives the money to wet a piece of it in the establishment where the trade was consummated. But, to my surprise, French Frank treated the house. He and I drank, which seemed just. But why should Johnny Heinhold, who owned the saloon and waited behind the bar, be invited to drink? I figured it immediately that he made a profit on the very drink he drank. I could, in a way, considering that they were friends and shipmates, understand Spider and Whiskey Bob being asked to drink, but why should the longshoremen, Bill Kelly and Soup Kennedy, be asked? Then there was Pat, the Queen's brother, making a total of 8 of us. It was early morning, and all ordered whiskey. What could I do here in this company of big men all drinking whiskey? "Whiskey," I said, with the careless air of one who had said it 1,000 times. And such whiskey! I tossed it down. Arrgh! I can taste it yet. And I was appalled at the price French Frank had paid. 80 cents. 80 cents. It was an outrage to my thrifty soul. 80 cents. The equivalent of 8 long hours of my toil at the machine, gone down our throats, and gone like that, in a twinkling, leaving only a bad taste in the mouth. There was no discussion that French Frank was a waster. I was anxious to be gone, out into the sunshine, out over the water to my glorious boat. But all hands lingered. Even Spider, my crew, lingered. No hint broke through my obtuseness of why they lingered. I have often thought since of how they must have regarded me, the newcomer being welcomed into their company, standing at bar with them, and not standing for a single round of drinks. French Frank, who, unknown to me, had swallowed his chagrin since the day before, now that the money for the razzle-dazzle was in his pocket, began to behave curiously toward me. I sensed the change in his attitude, saw the forbidding glitter in his eyes, and wondered. The more I saw of men, the queerer they became. Johnny Heinhold leaned across the bar and whispered in my ear, "He's got it in for you. Watch out." I nodded comprehension of his statement and acquiescent in it, as a man should nod who knows all about men. But secretly I was perplexed. Heavens! How was I, who had worked hard and read books of adventure, and who was only 15 years old, who had not dreamed of giving the Queen of the Oyster Pirates a second thought, and who did not know that French Frank was madly and Latinly in love with her, how was I to guess that I had done him shame? And how was I to guess that the story of how the Queen had thrown him down on his own boat the moment I hove in sight was already the gleeful gossip of the waterfront? And by the same token, how was I to guess that her brother Pat's offishness with me was anything else than temperamental gloominess of spirit? Whiskey Bob got me aside a moment. "Keep your eyes open," he muttered. "Take my tip. French Frank's ugly. I'm going up river with him to get a schooner for oystering. When he gets down on the beds, watch out. He says he'll run you down. After dark, any time he's around, change your anchorage and douse your riding light. Savvy?" "Oh, certainly. I savvied." I nodded my head, and as one man to another thanked him for his tip and drifted back to the group at the bar. No, I did not treat. I never dreamed that I was expected to treat. I left with Spider, and my ears burn now as I try to surmise the things they must have said about me. I asked Spider in an offhand way what was eating French Frank. "He's crazy jealous of you," was the answer. "Do you think so?" I said, and dismissed the matter as not worth thinking about. But I leave it to anyone, the swell of my 15 years old manhood, at learning that French Frank, the adventurer of 50, the sailor of all the seas of all the world, was jealous of me, and jealous over a girl most romantically named the Queen of the Oyster Pirates. I had read of such things in books, and regarded them as personal probabilities of a distant maturity. Oh, I felt a rare young devil as we hoisted the mainsail that morning, broke out anchor, and filled away close hauled on the 3-mile beat to windward out into the bay. Such was my escape from the killing machine toil and my introduction to the oyster pirates. True, the introduction had begun with drink, and the life promised to continue with drink. But was I to stay away from it for such a reason? Wherever life ran free and great, there men drank. Romance and adventure seemed always to go down the street locked arm in arm with John Barleycorn. To know the two, I must know the third. Or else I must go back to my free library books and read of the deeds of other men and do no deeds of my own save slave for 10 cents an hour at a machine in a cannery. No, I was not to be deterred from this brave life on the water by the fact that the water dwellers had queer and expensive desires for beer and wine and whiskey. What if their notions of happiness included the strange one of seeing me drink? When they persisted in buying the stuff and thrusting it upon me, why, I would drink it. It was the price I would pay for their comradeship. And I didn't have to get drunk. I had not got drunk the Sunday afternoon I arranged to buy the razzle-dazzle, despite the fact that not one of the rest was sober. Well, I could go on into the future that way, drinking the stuff when it gave them pleasure that I should drink it, but carefully avoiding over-drinking. End of chapter 8. Chapters 9 and 10 of John Barleycorn, or Alcoholic Memoirs, by Jack London. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Chapter 9. Gradual as was my development as a heavy drinker among the oyster pirates, the real heavy drinking came suddenly, and was the result not of desire for alcohol, but of an intellectual conviction. The more I saw of the life, the more I was enamored of it. I can never forget my thrills the first night I took part in a concerted raid, when we assembled on board the Annie, rough men, big and unafraid, and weazened wharf rats, some of them ex-convicts, all of them enemies of the law and meriting jail, in sea boots and sea gear, talking in gruff, low voices, and Big George with revolvers strapped about his waist to show that he meant business. Oh, I know, looking back, that the whole thing was sordid and silly. But I was not looking back in those days when I was rubbing shoulders with John Barleycorn and beginning to accept him. The life was brave and wild, and I was living the adventure I had read so much about. Nelson, young Scratch, they called him, to distinguish him from Old Scratch, his father, sailed in the sloop Reindeer, partners with one Clam. Clam was a daredevil, but Nelson was a reckless maniac. He was 20 years old with the body of a Hercules. When he was shot in Benicia a couple of years later, the coroner said he was the greatest shouldered man he had ever seen laid on a slab. Nelson could not read or write. He had been dragged up by his father on San Francisco Bay, and boats were second nature with him. His strength was prodigious, and his reputation along the waterfront for violence was anything but savoury. He had berserker rages and did mad, terrible things. I made his acquaintance the first cruise of the Razzle-Dazzle, and saw him sail the Reindeer in a blow and dredge oysters all around the rest of us as we lay at 2 anchors, troubled with fear of going ashore. He was some man, this Nelson, and when, passing by the Last Chance saloon, he spoke to me, I felt very proud. But try to imagine my pride when he promptly asked me in to have a drink. I stood at the bar and drank a glass of beer with him and talked manfully of oysters and boats and of the mystery of who had put the load of buckshot through the Annie's mainsail. We talked and lingered at the bar. It seemed to me strange that we lingered. We had had our beer. But who was I to lead the way outside when great Nelson chose to lean against the bar? After a few minutes, to my surprise, he asked me to have another drink, which I did. And still we talked, and Nelson evinced no intention of leaving the bar. Bear with me while I explain the way of my reasoning and of my innocence. First of all, I was very proud to be in the company of Nelson, who was the most heroic figure among the oyster pirates and bay adventurers. Unfortunately for my stomach and mucous membranes, Nelson had a strange quirk of nature that made him find happiness in treating me to a beer. I had no moral disinclination for beer, and just because I didn't like the taste of it and the weight of it was no reason I should forego the honour of his company. It was his whim to drink beer, and to have me drink beer with him. Very well, I would put up with the passing discomfort. So we continued to talk at the bar and to drink beer ordered and paid for by Nelson. I think now, when I look back upon it, that Nelson was curious. He wanted to find out just what kind of a gink I was. He wanted to see how many times I'd let him treat without offering to treat in return. After I had drunk half a dozen glasses, my policy of temperateness in mind, I decided that I had had enough for that time. So I mentioned that I was going aboard the Razzle Dazzle, then lying at the city wharf 100 yards away. I said good-bye to Nelson and went on down the wharf. But John Barleycorn, to the extent of 6 glasses, went with me. My brain tingled and was very much alive. I was uplifted by my sense of manhood. I, truly true oyster pirate, was going aboard my own boat after hobnobbing in the Last Chance with Nelson, the greatest oyster pirate of us all. Strong in my brain was the vision of us leaning against the bar and drinking beer. And curious it was, I decided, this whim of nature that made men happy in spending good money for beer for a fellow like me who didn't want it. As I pondered this, I recollected that several times other men, in couples, had entered the Last Chance, and first one, then the other, had treated to drinks. I remembered, on the Drunk on the Idler, how Scotty and the harpooner and myself had raked and scraped dimes and nickels with which to buy the whiskey. Then came my boy code, when on a day a fellow gave another a cannonball or a chunk of taffy, on some other day he would expect to receive back a cannonball or a chunk of taffy. That was why Nelson had lingered at the bar. Having bought a drink, he had waited for me to buy one. I had let him buy 6 drinks, and I never once offered to treat. And he was the great Nelson. I could feel myself blushing with shame. I sat down on the stringer piece of the wharf and buried my face in my hands. And the heat of my shame burned up my neck and into my cheeks and forehead. I have blushed many times in my life, but never have I experienced so terrible a blush as that one. And sitting there on the stringer piece in my shame, I did a great deal of thinking and transvaluing of values. I had been born poor. Poor I had lived. I had gone hungry on occasion. I had never had toys nor playthings like other children. My first memories of life were pinched by poverty. The pinch of poverty had been chronic. I was 8 years old when I wore my first little undershirt actually sold in a store across the counter. And then it had been only one little undershirt. When it was soiled, I had to return to the awful homemade things until it was washed. I had been so proud of it that I insisted on wearing it without any outer garment. For the first time I mutinied against my mother, mutinied myself into hysteria until she let me wear the store undershirt so all the world could see. Only a man who has undergone famine can properly value food. Only sailors and desert dwellers know the meaning of fresh water. And only a child with a child's imagination can come to know the meaning of things it has long been denied. I early discovered that the only things I could have were those I got for myself. My meagre childhood developed meagreness. The first thing I had been able to get for myself had been cigarette pictures, cigarette posters, and cigarette albums. I had not had the spending of the money I earned, so I traded extra newspapers for these treasures. I traded duplicates with the other boys, and circulating, as I did, all about town, I had greater opportunities for trading and acquiring. It was not long before I had complete every series issued by every cigarette manufacturer, such as the Great Racehorses, Parisian Beauties, Women of All Nations, Flags of All Nations, Noted Actors, Champion Prize Fighters, etc. And each series I had 3 different ways: in the card from the cigarette package, in the poster, and in the album. Then I began to accumulate duplicate sets, duplicate albums. I traded for other things that boys valued and which they usually bought with money given them by their parents. Naturally, they did not have the keen sense of values that I had, who was never given money to buy anything. I traded for postage stamps, for minerals, for curios, for birds' eggs, for marbles. I had a more magnificent collection of agates than I have ever seen any boy possess. And the nucleus of the collection was a handful worth of at least $3, which I had kept as security for 20 cents I loaned to a messenger boy who was sent to reform school before he could redeem them. I'd trade anything and everything for anything else, and turn it over in a dozen more trades until it was transmuted into something that was worth something. I was famous as a trader. I was notorious as a miser. I could even make a junk man weep when I had dealings with him. Other boys called me in to sell for them their collection of bottles, rags, old iron, grain, and gunny sacks, and 5-gallon oil cans, and give me a commission for doing it. And this was the thrifty, close-fisted boy, accustomed to slave at a machine for 10 cents an hour, who sat on the stringer piece and considered the matter of beer at 5 cents a glass and gone in a moment with nothing to show for it. I was now with men I admired. I was proud to be with them. Had all my pinching and saving brought me equivalent of one of the many thrills which had been mine since I came among the oyster pirates? Then what was worth while, money or thrills? These men had no horror of squandering a nickel or many nickels. They were magnificently careless of money, calling up 8 men to drink whisky at 10 cents a glass, as French Frank had shown. Why, Nelson had just spent 60 cents on beer for the 2 of us. Which was it to be? I was aware that I was making a grave decision. I was deciding between money and men, between niggardliness and romance. Either I must throw overboard all my old values of money and look upon it as something to be flung about wastefully, or I must throw overboard my comradeship with these men whose peculiar quirks made them like strong drink. I retraced my steps up the wharf to the Last Chance, where Nelson still stood outside. "Come on and have a beer," I invited. Again we stood at the bar and drank and talked, but this time it was I who paid 10 cents. A whole hour of my labour at a machine for a drink of something I didn't want and which tasted rotten. But it wasn't difficult. I had achieved a concept. Money no longer counted. It was comradeship that counted. "Have another?" I asked. And we had another, and I paid for it. Nelson, with the wisdom of the skilled drinker, said to the barkeeper, "Make mine a small one, Johnny." Johnny nodded and gave him a glass that contained only a third as much as the glasses we had been drinking. Yet the charge was the same, 5 cents. By this time I was getting nicely jingled, so such extravagance didn't hurt me much. Besides, I was learning. There was more in this buying of drinks than mere quantity. I got my finger on it. There was a stage when the beer didn't count at all, but just the spirit of comradeship of drinking together. And another thing. I, too, could call for small beers and minimize by 2/3 the detestable freightage with which comradeship burdened one. "I had to go aboard to get some money," I remarked casually as we drank, in the hope Nelson would take it as an explanation of why I had let him treat 6 consecutive times. "Oh, well, you didn't have to do that," he answered. "Johnny'll trust a fellow like you. Won't you, Johnny?" "Sure," Johnny agreed with a smile. "How much you got down against me?" Nelson queried. Johnny pulled out the book he kept behind the bar, found Nelson's page, and added up the account of several dollars. At once I became possessed with a desire to have a page in that book. Almost it seemed the final badge of manhood. After a couple more drinks, for which I insisted on paying, Nelson decided to go. We parted true comradely, and I wandered down the wharf to the razzle-dazzle. Spider was just building the fire for supper. "Where'd you get it?" he grinned up at me through the open companion. "Oh, I've been with Nelson," I said carelessly, trying to hide my pride. Then an idea came to me. Here was another one of them. Now that I had achieved my concept, I might as well practice it thoroughly. "Come on," I said. "Up to Johnny's and have a drink." Going up the wharf, we met Clam coming down. Clam was Nelson's partner, and he was a fine, brave, handsome, moustached man of 30. Everything, in short, that his nickname did not connote. "Come on," I said, "and have a drink." He came. As we turned into the Last Chance, there was Pat, the Queen's brother, coming out. "What's your hurry?" I greeted him. "We're having a drink. Come on along." "I've just had one," he demurred. "What of it? We're having one now," I retorted. And Pat consented to join us, and I melted my way into his good graces with a couple of glasses of beer. Oh, I was learning things that afternoon about John Barleycorn. There was more in him than the bad taste when you swallowed him. Here, at the absurd cost of 10 cents, a gloomy, grouchy individual who threatened to become an enemy was made into a good friend. He became even genial. His looks were kindly, and our voices mellowed together as we talked waterfront and oyster bed gossip. "Small beer for me, Johnny," I said, when the others had ordered schooners. Yes, and I said it like the accustomed drinker, carelessly, casually, as a sort of spontaneous thought that had just occurred to me. Looking back, I am confident that the only one there who guessed I was a tyro at bar drinking was Johnny Heinhold. "Where'd he get it?" I overheard Spider confidentially ask Johnny. "Oh, he's been sousing here with Nelson all afternoon," was Johnny's answer. I never let on that I'd heard, but proud? Aye, even the barkeeper was giving me a recommendation as a man. "He's been sousing here with Nelson all afternoon." Magic words. The accolade delivered by a barkeeper with a beer glass. I remembered that French Frank had treated Johnny the day I bought the razzle-dazzle. The glasses were filled and we were ready to drink. "Have something yourself, Johnny," I said, with an air of having intended to say it all the time, but of having been a trifle remiss because of the interesting conversation I had been holding with Clam and Pat. Johnny looked at me with quick sharpness, divining, I am positive, the strides I was making in my education, and poured himself whiskey from his private bottle. This hit me for a moment on my thrifty side. He had taken a 10-cent drink when the rest of us were drinking 5-cent drinks. But the hurt was only for a moment. I dismissed it as ignoble, remembering my concept, and did not give myself away. "You'd better put me down in the book for this," I said, when we had finished the drink. And I had the satisfaction of seeing a fresh page devoted to my name and a charge penciled for a round of drinks amounting to 30 cents. And I glimpsed, as through a golden haze, a future wherein that page would be much charged and crossed off and charged again. I treated a second time around, and then, to my amazement, Johnny redeemed himself in that matter of the 10-cent drink. He treated us around from behind the bar, and I decided that he had arithmetically evened things up handsomely. "Let's go around to the St. Louis house," Spider suggested when we got outside. Pat, who had been shoveling coal all day, had gone home, and Clam had gone upon the Reindeer to cook supper. So around Spider and I went to the St. Louis House, my first visit. A huge barroom where perhaps 50 men, mostly longshoremen, were congregated. And there I met Soup Kennedy for the second time, and Bill Kelly. And Smith of the Annie drifted in, he of the belt-buckled revolvers. And Nelson showed up. And I met others, including the Vigie brothers, who ran the place, and the chiefest of all, Joe Goose, with the wicked eyes, the twisted nose, and the flowered vest, who played the harmonica like a roistering angel, and who went on the most atrocious tears that even the Oakland waterfront could conceive of and admire. As I bought drinks, others treated as well, the thought flickered across my mind that Mammy Jenny wasn't going to be repaid much on her loan out of that week's earnings of the razzle-dazzle. But what of it, I thought, or rather John Barleycorn thought it for me. You're a man, and you're getting acquainted with men. Mammy Jenny doesn't need the money as promptly as all that. She isn't starving. You know that. She's got other money in the bank. Let her wait, and pay her back gradually. And thus it was I learned another trait of John Barleycorn. He inhibits morality. Wrong conduct that is impossible for one to do sober is done quite easily when one is not sober. In fact, it is the only thing one can do, for John Barleycorn's inhibition rises like a wall between one's immediate desires and long-learned morality. I dismissed my thought of debt to Mammy Jenny and proceeded to get acquainted at the trifling expense of some trifling money and a jingle that was growing unpleasant. Who took me on board and put me to bed that night I do not know, but I imagine it must have been Spider. End of Chapter 9. Chapter 10. And so I won my manhood spurs. My status on the waterfront and with the oyster pirates became immediately excellent. I was looked upon as a good fellow as well as no coward. And somehow, from the day I achieved that concept sitting on the stringer piece of the Oakland City wharf, I have never cared much for money. No one has ever considered me a miser since, while my carelessness of money is a source of anxiety and worry to some that know me. So completely did I break with my parsimonious past that I sent word home to my mother to call in the boys of the neighbourhood and give to them all my collections. I never even cared to learn what boys got what collections. I was a man now, and I made a clean sweep of everything that bound me to my boyhood. My reputation grew. When the story went around the waterfront of how French Frank had tried to run me down with his schooner, and of how I had stood on the deck of the Razzle-Dazzle, a cocked, double-barrel shotgun in my hands, steering with my feet, and holding her to her course, and compelled him to put up his wheel and keep away, the waterfront decided that there was something in me despite my youth. And I continued to show what was in me. There were the times I brought the Razzle-Dazzle in with a bigger load of oysters than any other two-man craft. There was the time when we raided far down in Lower Bay, and mine was the only craft back at daylight to the anchorage off Asparagus Island. There was the Thursday night we raced for market, and I brought the Razzle-Dazzle in without a rudder, first of the fleet, and skimmed the cream of the Friday morning trade. And there was the time I brought her in from Upper Bay under a jib when Scotty burned my mainsail. Yes, it was Scotty of the Idler adventure. Irish had followed Spider on board the Razzle-Dazzle, and Scotty, turning up, had taken Irish's place. But the things I did on the water only partly counted. What completed everything and won for me the title of Prince of the Oyster Beds was that I was a good fellow ashore with my money, buying drinks like a man. I little dreamed that the time would come when the Oakland waterfront, which had shocked me at first, would be shocked and annoyed by the devilry of the things I did. But always the life was tied up with drinking. The saloons are poor men's clubs. Saloons are congregating places. We engaged to meet one another in saloons. We celebrated our good fortune or wept our grief in saloons. We got acquainted in saloons. Can I ever forget the afternoon I met Old Scratch, Nelson's father? It was in the Last Chance. Johnny Heinhold introduced us. That Old Scratch was Nelson's father was noteworthy enough. But there was more to it than that. He was owner and master of the scow schooner Annie Mine, and some day I might ship as a sailor with him. Still more, he was romance. He was a blue-eyed, yellow-haired, raw-boned Viking, big-bodied and strong-muscled despite his age. And he had sailed the seas in ships of all nations in the old savage sailing days. I had heard many weird tales about him and worshipped him from a distance. It took the saloon to bring us together. Even so, our acquaintance might have been no more than a hand grip and a word — he was a laconic old fellow — had it not been for the drinking. "Have a drink," I said, with promptitude, after the pause which I had learned good form in drinking dictates. Of course, while we drank our beer, which I had paid for, it was incumbent on him to listen to me and to talk to me. And Johnny, like a true host, made the tactful remarks that enabled us to find mutual topics of conversation. And of course, having drunk my beer, Captain Nelson must now buy beer in turn. This led to more talking, and Johnny drifted out of the conversation to wait on other customers. The more beer Captain Nelson and I drank, the better we got acquainted. In me he found an appreciative listener, who by virtue of book reading knew much about the sea life he had lived. So he drifted back to his wild young days, and spun many a rare yarn for me, while we downed beer, treat by treat, although a blessed summer afternoon. And it was only John Barleycorn that made possible that long afternoon with the old sea dog. It was Johnny Heinhold who secretly warned me across the bar that I was getting pickled and advised me to take small beers. But as soon as Captain Nelson drank large beers, my pride forbade anything else than large beers. and not until the skipper ordered his first small beer did I order one for myself. Oh, when we came to a lingering fond farewell, I was drunk. But I had the satisfaction of seeing Old Scratch as drunk as I. My youthful modesty scarcely let me dare believe that the hardened old buccaneer was even more drunk. And afterwards, from Spider and Pat and Clam and Johnny Heinhold and others came the tips that Old Scratch liked me, and had nothing but good words for the fine lad I was. Which was the more remarkable because he was known as a savage, cantankerous old cuss who never liked anybody. His very nickname, Scratch, arose from a berserker trick of his, in fighting, of tearing off his opponent's face. And that I had won his friendship, all thanks were due to John Barleycorn. I have given the incident merely as an example of the multitudinous lures and draws and services by which John Barleycorn wins his followers. End of chapter 10. Of John Barleycorn, or Alcoholic Memoirs, by Jack London. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Chapter 11. And still there arose in me no desire for alcohol, no chemical demand. In years and years of heavy drinking, drinking did not beget the desire. Drinking was the way of life I led, the way of the men with whom I lived. While away on my cruises on the bay, I took no drink along. And while out on the bay, the thought of the desirableness of a drink never crossed my mind. It was not until I tied the razzle-dazzle up to the wharf and got ashore in the congregating places of men, where drink flowed, that the buying of drinks for other men and the accepting of drinks from other men devolved upon me as a social duty and a manhood right. Then, too, there were the times lying at the city wharf or across the estuary on the sandpit when the Queen and her sister and her brother Pat and Mrs. Hadley came aboard. It was my boat. I was host, and I could only dispense hospitality in the terms of their understanding of it. So I would rush Spider, or Irish, or Scotty, or whoever was my crew, with the can for beer and the demijohn for red wine. And again, lying at the wharf disposing of my oysters, there were dusky twilights when big policemen and plain-clothes-men stole on board. And because we lived in the shadow of the police, we opened oysters and fed them to them with squirts of pepper sauce and rushed the growler or got stronger stuff in bottles. Drink as I would, I couldn't come to like John Barleycorn. I valued him extremely well for his associations, but not for the taste of him. All the time I was striving to be a man amongst men, and all the time I nursed secret and shameful desires for candy. But I would have died before I'd let anybody guess it. I used to indulge in lonely debauches on nights when I knew my crew was going to sleep ashore. I would go up to the free library, exchange my books, buy a quarter's worth of all sorts of candy that chewed and lasted, sneak aboard the Razzle-Dazzle, lock myself in the cabin, go to bed, and lie there long hours of bliss, reading and chewing candy. And those were the only times I felt that I got my real money's worth. Dollars and dollars across the bar couldn't buy the satisfaction that 25 cents did in a candy store. As my drinking grew heavier, I began to note more and more that it was in the drinking bouts the purple passages occurred. Drunks were always memorable. At such times things happened. Men like Joe Goose dated existence from drunk to drunk. The longshoremen all looked forward to their Saturday night drunk. We, of the oyster boats, waited until we had disposed of our cargoes before we got really started, though a scattering of drinks and a meeting of a chance friend sometimes precipitated an accidental drunk. In ways, the accidental drunks were the best. Stranger and more exciting things happened at such times, as, for instance, the Sunday when Nelson and French Frank and Captain Spink stole the stolen salmon boat from Whiskey Bob and Nicky the Greek. Changes had taken place in the personnel of the oyster boats. Nelson had got into a fight with Bill Kelly on the Annie and was carrying a bullet hole through his left hand. Also, having quarrelled with Clam and broken partnership, Nelson had sailed the Reindeer, his arm in a sling, with a crew of 2 deep-water sailors, and he had sailed so madly as to frighten them ashore. Such was the tale of his recklessness they spread, that no one on the waterfront would go out with Nelson. So the Reindeer, crewless, lay across the estuary at the sandspit. Beside her lay the Razzle-Dazzle, with a burned mainsail and Scotty and me on board. Whiskey Bob had fallen out with French Frank and gone on a raid upriver with Nicky the Greek. The result of this raid was a brand new Columbia River salmon boat, stolen from an Italian fisherman. We oyster pirates were all visited by the searching Italian, and we were convinced, from what we knew of their movements, that Whiskey Bob and Nicky the Greek were the guilty parties. But where was the salmon boat? Hundreds of Greek and Italian fishermen upriver and down the bay had searched every slough and tool patch for it. When the owner despairingly offered a reward of $50, our interest increased and the mystery deepened. One Sunday morning, old Captain Spink paid me a visit. The conversation was confidential. He had just been fishing in his skiff at the old Alameda ferry slip. As the tide went down, he had noticed a rope tied to a pile under water and leading downward. In vain he had tried to heave up what was fast on the other end. Farther along, to another pile, was a similar rope leading downward and unheavable. Without doubt, it was the missing salmon boat. If we restored it to its rightful owner, there was $50 in it for us. But I had queer ethical notions about honour amongst thieves and declined to have anything to do with the affair. But French Frank had quarrelled with Whisky Bob, and Nelson was also an enemy. Poor Whisky Bob! Without viciousness, good-natured, generous, born weak, raised poorly, with an irresistible chemical demand for alcohol, still prosecuting his vocation of bay pirate, his body was picked up, not long afterward, beside a dock where it had sunk full of gunshot wounds. Within an hour after I had rejected Captain Spink's proposal, I saw him sail down the estuary on board the Reindeer with Nelson. Also, French Frank went by on his schooner. It was not long ere they sailed back up the estuary, curiously side by side. As they headed in for the Sandspit, the submerged salmon boat could be seen, gunwales awash, and held up from sinking by ropes fast to the schooner and the sloop. The tide was half out, and they sailed squarely in on the sand, grounding in a row, with the salmon boat in the middle. Immediately Hans, one of French Frank's sailors, was into a skiff and pulling rapidly for the north slope. The big demijohn in the stern sheets told his errand. They couldn't wait a moment to celebrate the $50 they had so easily earned. It is the way of the devotees of John Barleycorn. When good fortune comes, they drink. When they have no fortune, they drink to the hope of good fortune. If fortune be ill, they drink to forget it. If they meet a friend, they drink. If they quarrel with a friend and lose him, they drink. If their love-making be crowned with success, they are so happy they needs must drink. If they be jilted, they drink for the contrary reason. And if they haven't anything to do at all, why, they take a drink, secure in the knowledge that when they have taken a sufficient number of drinks, the maggots will start crawling in their brains and they will have their hands full with things to do. When they are sober, they want to drink. And when they have drunk, they want to drink more. Of course, as fellow comrades, Scotty and I were called in for the drinking. We helped to make a hole in that $50 not yet received. The afternoon, from just an ordinary common summer Sunday afternoon, became a generous purple afternoon. We all talked and sang and ranted and bragged, and ever French Frank and Nelson sent more drinks around. We lay in full sight of the Oakland waterfront, and the noise of our revels attracted friends. Skiff after skiff crossed the estuary and hauled up on the Sandspit, while Hans' work was cut out for him, ever to row back and forth for more supplies of booze. Then Whisky Bob and Nicky the Greek arrived, sober, indignant, outraged in that their fellow pirates had raised their plant. French Frank, aided by John Barleycorn, orated hypocritically about virtue and honesty, and despite his 50 years, got Whisky Bob out on the sand and proceeded to lick him. When Nicky the Greek jumped in with a short-handed shovel to Whisky Bob's assistant, short work was made of him by Hans. And, of course, when the bleeding remnants of Bob and Nicky were sent packing in their skiff, the event must needs be celebrated in further carousal. By this time, our visitors being numerous, we were a large crowd compounded of many nationalities and diverse temperaments, all aroused by John Barleycorn, all restraints cast off. Old quarrels revived, ancient hates flared up. Fight was in the air. And whenever a longshoreman remembered something against a scow schooner sailor, or vice versa, or an oyster pirate remembered or was remembered, a fist shot out and another fight was on. And every fight was made up in more rounds of drinks, wherein the combatants, aided and abetted by the rest of us, embraced each other and pledged undying friendship. And of all times, Soup Kennedy selected this time to come and retrieve an old shirt of his, left aboard the Reindeer from the trip he sailed with Clam. He had espoused Clam's side of the quarrel with Nelson. Also, he had been drinking in the St. Louis house, so that it was John Barleycorn who led him to the sandpit in quest of his old shirt. Few words started the fray. He locked with Nelson in the cockpit of the Reindeer, and in the mix-up barely escaped being brained by an iron bar wielded by irate French Frank. Irate because a two-handed man had attacked a one-handed man. If the Reindeer still floats, the dent of the iron bar remains in the hardwood rail of her cockpit. But Nelson pulled his bandaged hand, bullet perforated, out of its sling, and held by us, wept and roared his berserker belief that he could lick Soup Kennedy one-handed. And we let them loose on the sand. Once, when it looked as if Nelson were getting the worst of it, French Frank and John Barleycorn sprang unfairly into the fight. Scotty protested and reached for French Frank, who whirled upon him and fell on top of him in a pummeling clinch after a sprawl of 20 feet across the sand. In the course of separating these two, half a dozen fights started amongst the rest of us. These fights were finished one way or the other, or we separated them with drinks, while all the time Nelson and Soup Kennedy fought on. Occasionally we returned to them and gave advice, such as, when they lay exhausted in the sand, unable to strike a blow, "Throw sand in his eyes." And they threw sand in each other's eyes, recuperated, and fought on to successive exhaustions. And now, of all this that is squalid and ridiculous and bestial, try to think what it meant to me, a youth not yet 16, burning with the spirit of adventure, fancy filled with tales of buccaneers and sea rovers, sacks of cities and conflicts of armed men, and imagination maddened by the stuff I had drunk. It was life raw and naked, wild and free, the only life of that sort which my birth in time and space permitted me to attain. And more than that, it carried a promise. It was the beginning. From the sandspit, the way led out through the Golden Gate to the vastness of adventure of all the world, where battles would be fought, not for old shirts and over stolen salmon boats, but for high purposes and romantic ends. And because I told Scotty what I thought of his letting an old man like French Frank get away with him, we two brawled and added to the festivity of the sandpit. And Scotty threw up his job as crew and departed in the night with a pair of blankets belonging to me. During the night, while the other oyster pirates lay stupefied in their bunks, the schooner and the Reindeer floated on the high water and swung about to their anchors. The salmon boat, still filled with rocks and water, rested on the bottom. In the morning, early, I heard wild cries from the Reindeer, and tumbled out in the chill gray to see a spectacle that made the waterfront laugh for days. The beautiful salmon boat lay on the hard sand, squashed flat as a pancake, while on it were perched French Frank's schooner and the Reindeer. Unfortunately, two of the Reindeer's planks had been crushed in by the stout oak stem of the salmon boat. The rising tide had flowed through the hole and just awakened Nelson by getting into his bunk with him. I lent a hand, and we pumped the Reindeer out and repaired the damage. Then Nelson cooked breakfast, and while we ate, we considered the situation. He was broke. So was I. The $50 reward would never be paid for that pitiful mess of splinters on the sand beneath us. He had a wounded hand and no crew. I had a burned mainsail and no crew. "What do you say, you and me?" Nelson queried. "I'll go you," was my answer. And thus I became partners with young Scratch Nelson, the wildest, maddest of them all. We borrowed the money for an outfit of grub from Johnny Heinhold, filled our water barrels, and sailed away that day for the oyster beds. End of chapter 12. Nor have I ever regretted those months of mad devilry I put in with Nelson. He could sail, even if he did frighten every man that sailed with him. To steer to misdestruction by an inch or an instant was his joy. To do what everybody else did not dare attempt to do was his pride. Never to reef down was his mania. And in all the time I spent with him, blow high or low, the Reindeer was never reefed. Nor was she ever dry. We strained her open and sailed her open and sailed her open continually. And we abandoned the Oakland waterfront and went wider afield for our adventures. And all this glorious passage in my life was made possible for me by John Barleycorn. And this is my complaint against John Barleycorn. Here I was, thirsting for the wild life of adventure, and the only way for me to win to it was through John Barleycorn's meditation. It was the way of the men who lived the life. Did I wish to live the life, I must live it the way they did. It was by virtue of drinking that I gained that partnership and comradeship with Nelson. Had I drunk only the beer he paid for, or had I declined to drink at all, I should never have been selected by him as a partner. He wanted a partner who would meet with him on the social side, as well as the work side of life. I abandoned myself to the life and developed the misconception that the secret of John Barleycorn lay in going on mad drunks, rising through the successive stages that only an iron constitution could endure to final stupefaction and swinish unconsciousness. I do not like the taste, so I drank for the sole purpose of getting drunk, of getting hopelessly, helplessly drunk. And I, who had saved and scraped, traded like a Shylock and made junkmen weep, I, who had stood aghast when French Frank, at a single stroke, spent 80 cents for whiskey for 8 men, I turned myself loose with a more lavish disregard for money than any of them. I remember going ashore one night with Nelson. In my pocket were $180. It was my intention first to buy some clothes, after that some drinks. I needed the clothes. All I possessed were on me, and they were as follows: a pair of sea boots that providentially leaked the water out as fast as it ran in, a pair of 50-cent overalls, a 40-cent cotton shirt, and a sou'wester. I had no hat, so I had to wear the sou'wester. And it will be noted that I have listed neither underclothes nor socks. I didn't own any. To reach the stores where clothes could be bought, we had to pass a dozen saloons. So I bought me the drinks first. I never got to the clothing stores. In the morning, broke, poisoned but contented, I came back on board and we set sail. I possessed only the clothes I had gone ashore in, and not a cent remained of the $180. It might well be deemed impossible by those who have never tried it that in 12 hours a lad can spend all of $180 for drinks. I know otherwise. And I had no regrets. I was proud. I had shown them I could spend with the rest of them. Amongst strong men I had proved myself strong. I had clinched again, as I had often clinched, my right to the title of Prince. Also, my attitude may be considered, in part, as a reaction from my childhood's meagreness and my childhood's excessive toil. Possibly my inchoate thought was, better to remain amongst booze fighters, a prince, than to toil 12 hours a day at a machine for 10 cents an hour. There are no purple passages in machine toil. But if the spending of $180 in 12 hours isn't a purple passage, then I'd like to know what is. Oh, I skip much of the details of my trafficking with John Barleycorn during this period, and shall only mention events that will throw light on John Barleycorn's ways. There were 3 things that enabled me to pursue this heavy drinking. First, a magnificent constitution far better than the average. Second, the healthy open-air life on the water. And third, the fact that I drank irregularly. While out on the water, we never carried any drink along. The world was opening up to me. Already I knew several hundred miles of the waterways of it, and of the towns and cities and fishing hamlets on the shores. Came the whisper to range farther. I had not found it yet. There was more behind. But even this much of the world was too wide for Nelson. he wearied for his beloved Oakland waterfront, and when he elected to return to it, we separated in all friendliness. I now made the old town of Benicia on the Carquinez Straits my headquarters. In a cluster of fishermen's arks, moored in the tules on the waterfront, dwelt a congenial crowd of drinkers and vagabonds, and I joined them. I had longer spells ashore, between fooling with salmon fishing and making raids up and down bay and rivers as a deputy fish patrolman, and I drank more and learned more about drinking. I held my own with anyone, drink for drink, and often drank more than my share to show the strength of my manhood. When, on a morning, my unconscious carcass was disentangled from the nets on the drying frames, whither I had stupidly, blindly crawled the night before, and when the waterfront talked it over with many a giggle and laugh and another drink, I was proud indeed. It was an exploit. And when I never drew a sober breath on one stretch for 3 solid weeks, I was certain I had reached the top. Surely, in that direction, one could go no farther. It was time for me to move on. For always, drunk or sober, at the back of my consciousness, something whispered that this carousing and bay adventuring was not all of life. This whisper was my good fortune. I happened to be so made that I could hear it calling, always calling, out and away over the world. It was not canniness on my part, it was curiosity, desire to know, an unrest and a seeking for things wonderful that I seemed somehow to have glimpsed or guessed. What was this life for, I demanded, if this were all? No, there was something more, away and beyond. And in relation to my much later development as a drinker, this whisper, this promise of the things at the back of life must be noted, for it was destined to play a dire part in my more recent wrestlings with John Barleycorn. But what gave immediacy to my decision to move on was a trick John Barleycorn played me, a monstrous, incredible trick that showed abysses of intoxication hitherto undreamed. At 1 o'clock in the morning, after a prodigious drunk, I was tottering aboard a sloop at the end of the wharf, intending to go to sleep. The tide swept through Carquinez Straits as in a mill race, and the full ebb was on when I stumbled overboard. There was nobody on the wharf, nobody on the sloop. I was borne away by the current. I was not startled. I thought the misadventure delightful. I was a good swimmer, and in my inflamed condition, the contact of the water with my skin soothed me like cool linen. And then John Barleycorn played me his maniacal trick. Some maundering fancy of going out with the tide suddenly obsessed me. I had never been morbid. Thoughts of suicide had never entered my head. And now that they entered, I thought it fine, a splendid culminating, a perfect rounding off of my short but exciting career. I, who had never known girl's love, nor woman's love, nor the love of children, who had never played in the wide joy fields of art, nor climbed the star-cool heights of philosophy, nor seen with my eyes more than a pinpoint surface of the gorgeous world, I decided that this was all, that I had seen all, lived all, been all that was worth while, and that now was the time to cease. This was the trick of John Barleycorn, laying me by the heels of my imagination and in a drug dream dragging me to death. Oh, he was convincing. I had really experienced all of life, and it didn't amount to much. The swinish drunkenness in which I had lived for months, this was accompanied by the sense of degradation and the old feeling of conviction of sin, was the last and the best, and I could see for myself what it was worth. There were all the broken-down old bums and loafers I had bought drinks for. That was what remained of life. Did I want to become like them? 1,000 times no. And I wept tears of sweet sadness over my glorious youth going out with the tide. And who has not seen the weeping drunk, the melancholic drunk? They are to be found in all the bar-rooms, if they can find no other listener, telling their sorrows to the barkeeper who is paid to listen. The water was delicious. It was a man's way to die. John Barleycorn changed the tune he played in my drink-maddened brain. Away with tears and regret. It was a hero's death, and by the hero's own hand and will. So I struck up my death chant and was singing it lustily when the gurgle and splash of the current riffles in my ears reminded me of my more immediate situation. Below the town of Benicia, where the Solano wharf projects, the straits widen out into what bayfarers call the bight of Turner's shipyard. I was in the shore tide that swept under the Solano wharf and up into the bight. I knew of old the power of the suck which developed when the tide swung around the end of Dead Man's Island and drove straight for the wharf. I didn't want to go through those piles. It wouldn't be nice, and I might lose an hour in the bight on my way out with the tide. I undressed in the water and struck out with a strong, single overhand stroke, crossing the current at right angles. Nor did I cease until, by the wharf lights, I knew I was safe to sweep by the end. Then I turned over and rested. The stroke had been a telling one, and I was a little time in recovering my breath. I was elated, for I had succeeded in avoiding the suck. I started to raise my death chant again, a purely extemporized farrago of a drug-crazed youth. "Don't sing yet," whispered John Barleycorn. "The Solano runs all night. There are railroad men on the wharf. They will hear you, and come out in a boat and rescue you, and you don't want to be rescued." I certainly didn't. What? Be robbed of my hero's death? Never. And I lay on my back in the starlight, watching the familiar wharf lights go by, red and green and white, and bidding sad, sentimental farewell to them, each and all. When I was well clear in mid-channel, I sang again. Sometimes I swam a few strokes, but in the main I contented myself with floating and dreaming long, drunken dreams. Before daylight, the chill of the water and the passage of the hours had sobered me sufficiently to make me wonder what portion of the Straits I was in, and also to wonder if the turn of the tide wouldn't catch me and take me back ere I had drifted out into San Pablo Bay. Next, I discovered that I was very weary and very cold, and quite sober, and that I didn't in the least want to be drowned. I could make out the Selby smelter on the Contra Costa shore and the Mare Island lighthouse. I started to swim for the Solano shore, but was too weak and chilled, and made so little headway, and at the cost of such painful effort, that I gave it up and contented myself with floating, now and then giving a stroke to keep my balance in the tide rips which were increasing the commotion on the surface of the water. And new fear. I was sober now, and I didn't want to die. I discovered scores of reasons for living, and the more reasons I discovered, the more liable it seemed that I was going to drown anyway. Daylight, after I had been 4 hours in the water, found me in a parlous condition in the tide rips off Mare Island, where the swift ebbs from Vallejo Straits and Carquinez Straits were fighting with each other, and where, at that particular moment, they were fighting the flood tide setting up against them from San Pablo Bay. A stiff breeze had sprung up, and the crisp little waves were persistently lapping into my mouth, and I was beginning to swallow salt water. With my swimmer's knowledge, I knew the end was near. And then the boat came. A Greek fisherman running in for Vallejo. And again I had been saved from John Barleycorn by my constitution and physical vigour. And in passing, let me note that this maniacal trick John Barleycorn played me is nothing uncommon. An absolute statistic of the percentage of suicides due to John Barleycorn would be appalling. In my case, healthy, normal, young, full of the joy of life, the suggestion to kill myself was unusual, but it must be taken into account that it came on the heels of a long carouse, when my nerves and brain were fearfully poisoned, and that the dramatic, romantic side of my imagination, drink-maddened to lunacy, was delighted with the suggestion. And yet the older, more morbid drinkers, more jaded with life and more disillusioned, who kill themselves, do so usually after a long debauch, when their nerves and brains are thoroughly poison-soaked. End of chapter 12.